The government is excellent and spends your tax dollars efficiently. This is a two-part video discussing the role of government in a free society. In part 1, we will discuss the general role of the government, and in part 2, we will take a look at externalities, which are third-party effects like pollution, regulations, research, and other cases where a third party has been subjected to bearing a cost without agreement. The role of a government in a free society begs the question of what you mean by free. This video will use the word free in a sense of absence of coercion, and not in a sense of free lunch, which means absence of cost. By coercion, we mean the use of physical force or threat of force to make one person an agent of another person's will. It is not used in a broader sense of using propaganda, media, or other techniques. Persuasion is one thing. Coercion is very different. In a society, it is impossible to have absolute freedom. We must ask ourselves, what arrangements will minimize coercion while preserving maximum opportunity for members of a society to cooperate with one another to achieve their separate objectives? The fundamental principle that will be taken as a given when describing the role of the government in this video was stated by John Stuart Mill almost 200 years ago, that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. To a person who believes in a free society in this sense, the ideal outcome is unanimity. That you can have joint action as long as responsible individuals have agreed to cooperate after a free discussion. From this perspective, you can see the importance of a free market which enables you to achieve voluntary cooperation to achieve unanimity without conformity. Everyone can act in their own interest. If one person wants to buy shoes of one color, they can buy them. If another person wants shoes of a different color, they can buy shoes of a different color. Everyone is free to do their own thing within the limits of their resources. However, there are some cases in which you must have uniformity, cases where the answer is the same for all people. An obvious example is national defense. There is no way in which some people in a country can engage in an international war and other people not. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the people of Poland were at war regardless of their personal views. The decision is a yes or no decision that must be the same for all. Of course, it would be ideal that we should not engage in such joint activities unless we first achieved unanimity. But it is also clear that that's not a feasible option. You can't always afford the time to get everybody to agree on an issue. So we developed an expedient mechanism, something short of unanimity, a majority rule, to reach those kind of decisions which require conformity. It must be stressed that the majority rule is not a principle, it is an expedient. A lot of people equate democracy with majority rule, but that is a great mistake. There is nobody who believes in majority rule as an absolute. Nobody believes that it is okay to shoot 49% of the people if the other 51% vote to do so. The point of democracy is to give rights to minorities, and not merely the majorities. The Bill of Rights of the US Constitution is an attempt of that. For some purposes, we use simple majority. If it is more important to reach a decision than what decision to reach, simple majority can work. But if it is something more fundamental, like a foreign treaty or overriding presidential vetoes, a 2/3 vote is required, also called supermajority. If it is an attempt to amend the Constitution, a qualified majority of the various states as well as the Congress is required. This stresses the notion of a simple majority being just an expedient. The reason this is important is because every time you use political mechanism to reach decisions that require conformity, where majority votes and minority must conform, you stretch the social fabric that holds a stable society together. To stay stable, the society must have agreement of some basic common principles. But by relying more on political mechanism and less on the market mechanism, we put a greater strain on the things that hold the society together. This is why you can go much farther using the political mechanism in homogeneous societies like Sweden than a very diverse and heterogeneous society like United States. We were proud to call ourselves a melting pot, that we could live comfortably with many different groups of people, each with their traditions and culture, doing their own thing, yet cooperating with one another in areas of joint interest. But the more we relied on political mechanism to solve problems and allocate resources, we've tended to increase the advantage of ethnic isolation and frictions amongst the groups. This brings us to the role that the government should play in a society. It is to prevent coercion and to promote voluntary cooperation among responsible individuals. It is interesting to note that these are the principles that have a long history coming from Adam Smith, Thomas Jefferson, Stuart Mill, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and many other great philosophers and economists. The basic principles are very simple. First, to prevent one person from coercing another, the internal police function. Second is to provide national defense, to prevent coercion from outside. And third is to promote voluntary cooperation among people by defining the rules under which we agree to resolve disputes. The rules of the game are often taken for granted. Even people who agree with free market philosophy and private property take it for granted that the property is something that defines itself. But am I violating your property rights if I fly a plane 10 feet above your roof? What about 5,000 feet? Or what about 30,000 feet? This is obviously not natural, so we must define the rules of the game to agree on what rights each of us has. There are few more basic functions that the government should provide. Although most monopolies are the result of government action, one of the functions of the government is to promote voluntary cooperation in cases where it is impossible for the physical circumstance reasons. After all, to avoid coercion, you need availability of alternatives. A buyer is protected from a seller by a presence of alternative sellers. A worker is protected from his employer by having alternative employers he can work for. Free speech is protected by having alternative media and opinion sources. But there are cases like telephone companies, where it is not very feasible to have too many alternatives. Since we can only really believe in freedom for responsible individuals, there is a place for the government to protect irresponsible people. The two major groups are children and insane. This does not mean that these groups overlap. In fact, they are largely disjunct. But it is difficult to argue for freedom for either one of them. We have assigned the responsibility to the parents by considering family as a unit when enacting policies. But this does not mean that children are property of their parents. They should be treated as potentially responsible individuals whose freedoms must be protected. The problems arise because there are enormous number of activities that the government could attempt to justify on the grounds either that you have third-party effects or you're dealing with irresponsible individuals. After all, we all know that there are two types of people, ourselves and all those other irresponsible individuals. Using the principles above, on what grounds can one justify the force of vaccination for COVID-19 and vaccination passports if it has been proven that vaccinated people are as contagious as unvaccinated people? Remember the initial statement of John Stuart Mill, that power can only be exercised to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Without even going into effectiveness or potential long-term effects of the vaccine, on what principles can you justify making people take the vaccine if it is only for their own good? What about seatbelts and motorcycle helmets? You can justify safety measures to protect third parties, like pedestrians and other drivers, but how can you justify that the drivers need to protect themselves? One might be a fool not to wear a seatbelt or a helmet, but it is their life. What right does the government have to tell me to wear a seatbelt for my own good? Isn't the right to commit suicide a basic human right? Maybe it is not the one we would like to see exercised, but when you come down to the ultimate point, how can one justify illegality of suicide? Many would argue with what could be the correct answer, that by spreading themselves on the road, those irresponsible drivers will be taken by a government ambulance into a government hospital, buried using government money, and the rest of their family might have to be taken care by welfare. This only shows how one wrong breeds another wrong. If you go down this route and think about it, soon you come to realize what this proposition is really saying. It says that each of us are property of United States government with the sign on our back, do not fold, damage, or mutilate. There are many similar paternalistic regulations for adults that we can't justify, like tariffs on imports with minor exceptions for national defense, rent, price, or wage controls, and many other regulations like compulsory social security, licenses to practice occupations, or military draft, all of which will require a fuller discussion, or in this case a separate video in the future, to provide you with sufficient evidence and arguments. Part 2 of this video will discuss the more difficult and controversial areas of government involvement, third-party effects. Don't miss out! I hope you're having a nice day. Feel free to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos, and remember, nothing is as permanent as a temporary government program.